Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and our subject today is going to be dealing with the death of the arcade, or the alleged death of the arcade, as obviously my answer to this is no. But let me back it up with why and tell all those out there who make these slick videos talking about why arcades are dead or arguing about it online on social media or forums and making these grand proclamations are completely wrong. Now, who am I to tell you that you're completely wrong about something? Well, let me throw out my basic resume there in case you've never heard of me before, and then we'll get into the guts of the argument. And so I have been involved in the arcade industry since the late 90s, where I worked at what we call a family entertainment center, or an FEC. I worked in their arcade section there for about a year and a half, and I've done some other things not related to the arcade, of course. But in 2007 I started writing for this website called ArcadeHeroes.com, which had just started up at the end of 2006. And in 2010, 2011, around there, I took ownership of the site, and I've just been writing for it ever since and leading it there. I have sold arcade machines. I did so for 5 years at a company called BMI Gaming, where my best year, I think, was 2013 or so, where I sold around $2 million worth of equipment. Yeah, I sold a lot to home users, like Pac-Man machines and Golden Tee machines. I was always surprised how many people wanted a Golden Tee in their house. But I also sold a lot more to businesses, to a dead industry, supposedly. I write for a trade magazine called Replay Magazine. I've been doing that for many years as well, where I share, whoops, that's upside down, where I share my insight on the arcade industry there. So I've been published. I've published 2 books about the arcade. One is called The Arcade Experience, and where I got into a lot of the information that I'm going to cover here on this video, but that was 2013, so probably needs an update. I also, as you can see on my website there, the little ad, I did an arcade almanac in 2019. I had been meaning to do that every year, but then the pandemic happened, but may still get back to that. And I suppose the greatest part of the resumes to my arcade resume is that I've been an arcade operator since 2008, and opened up a month before the economy crashed back then, and it was originally called the Game Grid Arcade, that in 2020 had to change my name to Arcade Galactic due to a dispute of a local company flaunting their wealth. And as you can see here, I am at my first location. I do plenty of videos from here, a lot of my videos I do here. So that's where I'm coming from on this. Now, when I had to open up my arcade, I had to go to my city and find out what the regulations were regarding an arcade, and I called around to different cities and also found out from them, in case I wanted to open my business there, what restrictions, regulations, guidelines I had to follow to be able to get a business license. And the city where I'm at, West Valley City, was actually not stringent at all, but I talked with some other cities here where they had all sorts of rules that you had to jump through, where it's like, well, if you have this kind of machine, then you have to pay this much of a fee per year, and this kind of machine is that much, and it was kind of a big mess, and so I kind of avoided those places. That if you were wanting a definition of what an arcade is, well, getting a legal definition is going to be the more effective one to do it, as when I see these arguments pop up online or comments on YouTube videos and whatnot, it's usually very subjective, it's arbitrary. People just have this idea of what an arcade is in their head based on something that they saw when they were a kid or visited when they were a kid, but that's not going to hold any legal ground if something was to be taken to court or to be taxed. And so most cities out there, again, it's different for everyone, but I've seen some that say to be defined as an arcade, you have to have a certain number of machines of these coin-operated or pay-to-play machines in a location for it to be considered or taxed as an arcade. And the city where I'm at actually doesn't have any number for it, but I've heard anywhere as low as 3 to as much as 6 machines on site make it taxable as an arcade. Now, some places don't have any taxes for it at all, and so that's where you may have no worries there, but still, that's going to be your legal definition. And so we'll say if you have 6 games or more on site, then that makes you an arcade. Now, does it matter what type of pay-to-play machines they are? Not necessarily, not per a lot of legal definitions. And now I know that is one of the points that people will bring up a lot when they're proclaiming that the arcade is dead, saying, well, yeah, there's Dave and Buster's or there's Chuck E. Cheese's, but they're not real arcades. Like in the 80s we had real arcades. And it's like, well, actually you did have some ticket redemption back in the 80s. It just wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And why is it prevalent now? Because it makes tons of money. I saw a recent earnings report from a family entertainment center out there with quite a few games. They had a bunch of video games, but they also had a bunch of ticket redemption games. Guess what makes most of their money? Ticket redemption games. Now, I'm not saying that as a fan of ticket redemption games. I do not like them. I don't play them. I never have. Even when I was a kid, I wasn't interested in the ticket games at all. I wanted to play the video games. But still, a lot of people come to an arcade for tickets. And in fact, if you go on YouTube, the most popular arcade videos are from people playing ticket games and getting big ticket winnings, or gaming the machine to get the big ticket bonuses. Those get a ton more views than what I get. And so does that mean that it's an arcade because you're having fun that way and you like to have fun that way? Well, no. And again, these places that have these ticket redemption games, yes, they may have 60% or 70% or even 80% redemption games, but they still have a segment of video games there. And so why should it not be an arcade when it still has some video games around? I just don't see how that argument holds water. Now, let's dig a little further into this. Now, back in 2015 or 2016, there was a screaming child. There was a trade magazine known as Playmeter. Unfortunately, they stopped publishing around 2016, as being a trade magazine, a print magazine, is kind of a tough business. But one of the coolest things about Playmeter was that they would publish the State of the Industry report, and they would do so every single year. And the last year that they did it was for 2015. So yes, I do recognize that this data is old, but it still is useful, as I will get into here soon. And this also can answer, to a degree, the argument that I've also seen out there where people will say, well, arcades are dead because there aren't any near me. And as you can see from this 2015 data, well, with 166,760 locations out there that would be classified as arcades, how is that dead? Now, yes, I get it. There may be some out there who will push back saying, well, that's not what it was like in the 1980s. In 1982, there was 10 billion arcades or whatever. And yeah, there were a lot more arcades. There were a lot more arcade games released back then. I give you that. But is this Blockbuster Video numbers here? As far as I'm aware, there's only one left. Now, that I would call a dead industry. Or I would maybe call like the dial-up modem industry fairly dead. But something that in 2015, now, unfortunately, because their website doesn't exist anymore, it's a little hard to find this report. I'm using the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, to find this report here. But it was on a growth curve. And one thing that I have done on arcadeheroes.com over many years is do a post that I call Location Watch. And what I do here is I strive to find out and report about every single new arcade business that's opening their doors out there. Now, this year alone, from January to now, we only had 4 posts. As post-pandemic, it has been a little bit slower than it was but in like 2019, it was crazy. I was doing one, I think, about every month. And even in 2021, I did quite a few. But even for the 2022 ones, like if we click on this one from May here, I guess I probably should do the one from July since that's most recent. And I am going to be doing videos about location watches here soon. I would like to do these as both a blog post and a video just to help get the word out there. But as you can see, there's quite a few locations that are opening up. Now, in the argument, oh, well, there's no arcades near me, ergo they're dead. And that's just a strange logical fallacy. But there's a lot of places opening up out there. Yes, there are some that close sometimes, and that's unfortunate. But one thing that is the case is just because there might not be one near you, like if you live in the middle of Wyoming, which I drove through just a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of it's pretty barren. Even then, when we stopped at a restaurant to eat, I found in there, they were kind of a bar and grill, they had 4 arcade machines on site. And so I was still able to find something in the quote-unquote middle of nowhere. But just because some big place like this is not near you doesn't mean that they're all dead. Now, of course, from 2015, I really wish that somebody was publishing something like this so that we can now get some hard numbers as to how many are open, particularly after the pandemic. But again, up at least to 2019, it was exploding. And so I would guarantee you that these numbers would have been much higher by 2019. Unfortunately, just not sure where the numbers might be now with post-pandemic world. But again, with location watches, I've still been reporting about a lot of these, and these are only places I hear about. Unfortunately, there's no nationwide announcement of a new arcade opening. These are local stories of small businesses opening their doors, and most of them that I've come across have been what would be classified as bar arcades. Now, Playmeter, did not do that. They had these 3 definitions, and so they have arcades, they had street, which makes up a bulk of it, and then FECs, which are family entertainment centers. And the FECs would be like Dave & Buster's, Chuck E. Cheese's, Round One USA, Main Event, those sorts of giant places that have an arcade as a part of them, but they also have a lot of other attractions. Street would be something like if you visit a gas station and there's some arcade machines there, or a restaurant where it has a little room to the side with some machines, or a rest stop, or any place like that where the main business is not an arcade, but they do have some arcade machines on site. And so when you hear, if you ever have heard the term street operators or route operators, that's what makes up a huge bulk of the industry. But with the explosive growth of the FECs after 2015, like up through 2019, it was just so crazy. I wouldn't be surprised if this number was getting closer to 5,000, if not more. And that has been reflected in the types of games that have been developed. And that would be one big argument for me as to why it's wrong to assert that arcades are dead. But I'll get into that in a second. On FECs really quick, just talking about some of the big chains who I already name dropped. Dave & Buster's is an example. You go to their website, click on locations, you can search for one via city, state, zip code, or if you just go to this page, it lists out all of their locations. And they recently just spent almost $1 billion on acquiring Main Event, which was a smaller chain of arcades. And as far as I've heard, they are going to be converting some Dave & Buster's locations into Main Events and vice versa. I'm not sure what their logic is on that, but the Main Event name will still be sticking around, as will Dave & Buster's. But I haven't sat down and counted how many are here, but last time I did was getting somewhere close to 150, which is not a small number. I mean, no, they're not in every single state of the union, but they're in most. There's even one here in Utah. And so they have a good, strong reach, as does one of their competitors, Round One USA. And they jumped into the scene, I want to say it's somewhere around maybe 2017, 2018, and since they opened their first locations, I think it was out in California, they've just exploded across the country, and they are able to bring a lot of Japanese style games to their locations. But as you can see here, I mean, yes, if you do live in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, most of Nebraska, it can be, or Idaho, it can be tough to find one, and I recognize that. It's just in a lot of places there still are arcades, and just because you may live out somewhere that doesn't have one near you doesn't mean that there aren't other places on the planet that have some. And Round One is still in the process of expanding. Just on the front of their page, talking about 2 new locations, one in California, one in Washington State, that opened up, and they've been pretty adept at opening in malls and taking over like giant Sears spaces and such to convert those into their locations. And then of course you have the Chuck E. Cheese's, which again I would push back on them not being an arcade just because it has a lot of ticket games. I've seen plenty of locations that have video games in them too, just pure non-ticket video games. The one that I visited here in Salt Lake City a little while ago for a birthday party, I mean, yeah, most of the games were ticket stuff, but they had some things like Dead Storm Pirates and Mario Kart Arcade GPDX, and so why would they not be an arcade just because you don't like most of their stuff? Just because you don't like it doesn't change the definition of what they are. But before the pandemic, during the pandemic, Chuck E. Cheese did famously announce that they declared bankruptcy, but they've survived that, and they're still around. And I've been following their CEO on LinkedIn, and he's been talking a lot about different locations that are opening up, or some locations that are reopening. He just said that the location in Denver is reopening, and prior to the pandemic they had somewhere around 1,500 sites. I don't know how many closed down, but they would definitely be the largest arcade chain in the world. And these are just examples of 3 different companies. Now if you wanted to find some others that may not be part of a chain, although this site does track chains as well, although they're not always 100% accurate. Arcade.com/locations, or if you just click browse locations and then type in a city, state. I put in California here since that will tend to have a lot, but they list 131. This is all based on user feedback, so that's where it may not be 100% up to date. So like they only list 4 Dave & Buster's here, whereas on Dave & Buster's own page lists quite a few more locations than 4. But still, it's a resource to use to be able to find maybe some other lesser known arcades out there. And then we'll show anything from a place that has 1 arcade machine up to, let's see, what's the highest number on here. We got 88 at Casino Arcade in Santa Cruz. I think I've been to that one actually. And 72 at Oh Wow at Madera. And 64 at Playland Arcade. Looks like the Casino Arcade wins as far as this overall selection goes, but this also may not be fully accurate because they claim Dave & Buster's only has 4 machines or 2 machines, and that's just not going to be accurate. But still, it's one resource to help you locate arcades near you, and on top of what I try and report about. And so, are arcades dead from all this? Or is this like Blockbuster Video? Again, I don't think so. And to what I said earlier about working for an arcade distribution company and there being new games, like, you know, one thing I totally understand that's a bit frustrating for me is reporting about new arcades. And a lot of times, even when I report about arcade locations, they get very little traction and very few reads online. I care more about the reads than I do about the likes, but it's frustrating because if I ever post a single story about some place closing that may have been popular in the past, people lose their minds, and there's all sorts of discussion about that, and that's frustrating how oftentimes human nature gravitates more towards negative news as opposed to positive news.
Because good is dumb.
It's a lot harder to focus on the good stuff, which is what I try and do here on Arcade Heroes, is just focusing on good as much as I possibly can. But it's definitely an uphill battle. But as to the point I was getting to before I got off on a tangent, was that if you have all these places that are out there, they're also going to need new equipment. And now I get it, some people may not feel like some of these new games are real arcade games because they don't play like they did in the 80s, but again, that's not your decision to define. I mean, maybe it's not for you, but for the rest of the world it is. And so the reality is these are still video games that you're putting money into to play them, just like we were in the 80s. Yes, the game styles have changed a lot, for better or for worse, but they're still arcade machines. And you still have a lot of companies out there supporting this industry, because if you have more than 160,000, I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer to 200,000. I even remember at IAPA 2019, in fact, in this photo here, this is from 2021, and you can see right here the guy with the mask on was Eugene Jarvis, the famous creator of Defender and Robotron 2084, Cruisin' USA. He's the CEO of Raw Thrills, the company that makes this game sitting right here, The Walking Dead. And so he told me in 2019 that the status of the arcade industry, it felt a lot like the 90s as to how many locations were out there and what they were doing for that. And so if we were to visit a distributor site, here's Primetime Amusements. They're one of the advertisers on arcadeheroes.com. Yes, they do have a couple of defunct companies that no longer manufacture games because they sell used stuff. But most of the companies, if you were to go to their product catalog and sort by manufacturer, most of these are still in business and are still making equipment. Now, who would they be making this for if the arcade industry was dead? Would they be making it just for the billionaires that are out there in the United States? I mean, last number I saw, there's under 800 billionaires out there. And I doubt that all of them are so much into arcade games that they're buying one for one of their mansions or vacation homes every month. I mean, yeah, I did sell some machines to some well-off people, and even sold a bowling lane once to a guy, I think it was in Louisiana. That's not a sustainable business just to be supporting, say, the ultra rich for this many companies to be doing. When it comes to these locations, arcades and street locations and FECs, they need new equipment to continue making money. And as we do on arcadeheroes.com, if you click on new releases, you will find all of the new releases that have come out for the present year, as well as what's coming soon as far as what I know about. But just this year alone, 2022, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 games already launched, with definitely more to come. And so, is that a dead industry? Now, yes, I give to those who use the argument of comparing everything to 1982. Well, there was like 300 games released in 1982. 19 is nothing, but that's still not exactly dead. I mean, yes, I admit it's a much lower number, and the things aren't the 1980s anymore. I recognize that, but if you have companies like Raw Thrills or Sega or Bandai Namco or all those other ones that you saw dropping millions of dollars into research and development to create these new games. I mean, a lot of these video games can cost anywhere between $2 to $5 million to develop, and that doesn't count additional marketing and production afterwards of producing possibly thousands of cabinets. And so, yeah, it's just a fallacy to be claiming that all this is just being done for nobody. or for a dead industry that only has one location left on the planet. It's just not true. And one thing that's been a trend since I would say about 2017, 2018 or so is that a lot of these new games are being made not so much for the small places like me, but for those family entertainment centers. Like this right here, King Kong of Skull Island. This thing costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $45,000. And that's a tough one for a small place like me to grab. But for a place like Dave & Buster's, it's great. You know, they do have the budget to be able to get stuff like that. And Raw Thrills does have a game coming out here soon, which is also obviously targeted first at FECs, the Fast and Furious arcade machine that I've talked about before, and it's somewhere around $25,000 per unit, and you can link more together. But I'm hoping that they will release a version that's not quite as large, and they've done that before, such as with Halo Fireteam Raven. The first version they released was this super deluxe cabinet that handled up to 4 players, and later on they released a 2-player sit-down version. And we have seen a picture on test of one that's even smaller than this for 2 players. It uses the Aliens Armageddon cabinet, but haven't heard anything about it in a long time, so I'm not sure if that's actually still going to be happening. But again, these companies are making this content for their commercial customers first and foremost, and not for home users that may have the money to be able to afford. Like Halo was somewhere around, I think, 32,000. This version, the deluxe version, was around 12, 13,000. And so, yeah, if you disagree with me about all these points pushing back as to the industry as it is it a dead industry? I mean, yes, again, I do admit and I recognize it's a smaller industry than it was in the 80s, but I just have a real problem in that being called dead, as everybody who says that, you're not helping us out by permeating this lie that's giving people the impression that, oh, there's no arcades left. And I constantly get people who discover me as I'm in a mall here, and they'll come in and say something like, wow, I haven't seen an arcade in like 20 years, or oh, this brings me back to my childhood, or I didn't know that these existed anymore, and there's or that they made new games for them anymore. And there's these brand new games staring them right in the face. And I get it. Part of the problem is that I'm just one blog out there trying to push it. And yes, I do have some companions like Arcade Belgium or Wilcox Arcade that have also written about that. And on YouTube there are much bigger channels than mine which get a lot of traction, mainly with the Ticket Redemption side, but they still are promoting that there's new stuff happening out there. And we also have trade shows, big trade shows. The IAPA trade show that happens every November, I mean, that thing I'm pretty sure is much larger than E3 has been at its peak. Of course, anything's bigger than E3 now, just since they canceled it, at least maybe until next year. But IAPA has somewhere around 10 miles worth of aisles to walk through if you were to walk the entire floor of that convention center. Now, yes, not all of that's geared towards arcades, but the arcade area is pretty sizable. And I always cover that, and if you do a search on my channel, I have playlists that cover each IAPA going years back, and this is where they will often unveil brand new games for the industry and sell them to something that, again, if it's dead, why are they making these machines and selling it to these companies? If you disagree, let me know why you disagree. Maybe I missed a point, or maybe I'm wrong on something, but that's my reasoning as to why you're wrong if you believe that arcades are dead. Yes, they do have places to grow, and that's one reason why I do this site and these videos, is because I'm spreading the good word of arcades for people to learn about them and see that there are new games, and also just when I can trying to affect any changes to see some hardcore games coming out. And yes, there are hardcore games out there. From X Arcadia, they're definitely bringing back a lot of games that just we haven't seen those types of genres in years, and they do require skill to play them. But there's also nothing wrong with games that may not require skill, games for kids too. I mean, it's a big market, there's lots to appeal to, and that's what I try and do with my arcade mix, is trying to have a variety of stuff that appeals to all sorts of people. Because I'll get sometimes people that come in and are wanting to play just one game. Do you have Marvel vs. Capcom, or do you have Tekken or Street Fighter or Miss Pac-Man or this or that? And the more variety that I have, the better my chances of having something like that for them to be able to enjoy. And I'm able to offer that because there's enough manufacturers out there offering it, that hopefully the arcade industry will continue to bounce back from the pandemic. I mean, this summer has been a little tough for me and my business, but that hasn't really been related to the pandemic as much as just the general state of the economy. But I'm always working hard to keep the train moving forward and keeping this business alive. But let me know what your thoughts are, and we'll catch you on the next video.